It took less than 4 seconds to end years of racist terror inside America's most feared prison. 4 seconds. No shouting, no warning, no chance to take it back. Inside the cafeteria at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, a place designed to suppress violence through fear and routine, one man would be permanently blinded, and another would become a legend whose name would echo through American prisons for decades. This wasn't a riot. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't a moment of lost control. It was deliberate, calculated, and over before most people even realized it had begun. For years, intimidation had ruled quietly here. Racist harassment disguised as accidents, humiliation hidden just beyond the guard's gaze, men learning to survive by looking down, staying silent, enduring. And then, 3 seconds changed everything. A predator learned he was not untouchable. A message was delivered that could not be ignored, and the balance of fear inside the rock shifted forever. One man would leave that room screaming, bleeding, and blind in one eye, marked for life. The other would walk away in handcuffs, calm and silent, having proven that size means nothing when patience, intelligence, and timing are weaponized. What happened next would be written into prison folklore, whispered from cell to cell, carried from Alcatraz to Leavenworth to Atlanta to Marion. Because this story isn't about rage, it's about restraint, it's about waiting, and it's about what happens when a bully finally pushes the wrong man one last time. This is not a myth. This is not exaggeration. This is Alcatraz. Alcatraz was not built to rehabilitate men. It was built to break them. Rising out of the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, the rock existed for one purpose: to contain the inmates no other prison could control. Escape artists, murderers, men who had already proven that rules, walls, and fear meant nothing to them. Here there were no programs, no privileges worth earning, no illusions about second chances. At Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, punishment wasn't sudden, it was constant. Every movement was watched, every conversation measured, every breath taken under the gaze of guard towers that never blinked. Inmates feared Alcatraz more than death, because death was quick, Alcatraz was slow. Days were carved into rigid routine: wake, count, work, eat, silence. Meals eaten under watchful eyes, showers timed, steps counted. Silence wasn't encouraged here, it was enforced. Too much talking meant suspicion, suspicion meant isolation, and isolation on the rock was its own kind of torture. Weeks alone with nothing but concrete, darkness, and the sound of water slapping against stone. But beneath that silence, violence waited. It didn't explode like it did in other prisons, it simmered. In the 1950s, federal prisons reflected the racial fractures of the country outside their walls. Segregation may not have been official policy everywhere, but racism was deeply embedded in inmate hierarchies and at times quietly tolerated by those meant to enforce order. Black inmates were watched more closely, punished faster, protected less. White inmates with violent reputations learned quickly how to operate in the gray areas, how to intimidate without leaving bruises, how to humiliate without witnesses, how to terrorize without triggering paperwork. Alcatraz claimed absolute control, but control had blind spots. Guards saw everything until they didn't. They heard everything until they chose not to. And inside those blind spots, power shifted. A shove that looked accidental, food taken with resistance, a slur whispered just low enough to avoid consequence. Violence here wasn't loud, it was patient. And when it finally surfaced, it was punished brutally, unless ignoring it was more convenient. That was the reality of the Rock, a place where fear was currency, where reputation was protection, and where the quietest men were often the most dangerous. Because in Alcatraz, violence didn't announce itself. It waited.
Before Alcatraz, before the silence, before the legend hardened into prison folklore, there was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a man shaped not by impulse, but by calculation. Johnson came from Harlem, a world governed by numbers, alliances, betrayals, and long memory. He wasn't just a street enforcer, he was an architect, a strategist who built and protected a gambling empire worth millions, navigating a criminal landscape dominated by Italian mob families who rarely allowed black men to rise without bloodshed. Bumpy Johnson survived because he thought differently. He read constantly. He wrote poetry. He memorized faces, patterns, and habits. While other men chased reputation through noise and violence, Johnson cultivated something far more valuable: control. He understood leverage. He understood timing. And most importantly, he understood restraint. In Harlem, restraint kept you alive. That same discipline followed him into prison. When Johnson arrived at Alcatraz in the early 1950s, he didn't posture, he didn't threaten, he didn't demand respect. He earned it quietly, by observing first, speaking second, and acting only when action mattered. Inmates noticed immediately. He listened more than he talked. He never raised his voice. He never moved without purpose. And when he did speak, people leaned in. Johnson carried himself like a man who had already measured every possible outcome and chosen his words accordingly. That demeanor cut across racial lines. White inmates respected him because he didn't beg for approval. Black inmates revered him because he represented something rare inside federal prisons of that era: dignity that couldn't be stripped away. He didn't gamble recklessly. He didn't fight unnecessarily. He didn't react emotionally. And that made him dangerous. In prison culture, loud men attract attention, reckless men attract punishment, but quiet men who understand systems, those men last, those men survive, those men become untouchable. Understanding that violence was a tool, not an identity, something to be used sparingly, precisely, and only when it would end a problem permanently, that philosophy followed him everywhere, from Harlem streets to concrete cell blocks surrounded by icy water. So when inmates at Alcatraz saw Bumpy Johnson keep his composure while others exploded, when they saw him endure slights without response, they didn't see weakness, they saw calculation. Because men like Johnson didn't avoid violence out of fear, they avoided it because they were waiting for the right moment to make it unforgettable. Every prison has predators. Alcatraz specialized in containing them, and among the men feared even inside the Rock was Eric Pollson. Pollson was physically overwhelming, tall, heavy, and built like someone who had spent years turning confinement into a weapon. His size alone changed the air in a room. Men noticed when he entered. Conversations stopped. Bodies shifted away instinctively. But it wasn't just his strength that made him dangerous. It was his past. Pollson didn't arrive at Alcatraz by accident. He had already proven multiple times that violence came easily to him and that he felt no remorse afterward. Other prisons couldn't hold him. Other wardens couldn't control him. So he was sent to the Rock, where men like him were meant to disappear into routine and silence. But Pollson adapted. He learned quickly that open violence brought consequences: solitary confinement, lost privileges, endless reports. So instead of attacking openly, he terrorized psychologically. He studied the rules the same way a predator studies a fence, looking for gaps, moments without witnesses, angles guards couldn't see, behaviors that humiliated without technically violating policy. Food taken without a punch thrown, bodies bumped just hard enough to hurt, just soft enough to deny intent.
whispers delivered when guards were a few steps too far away, and always the message was the same: dominance. Pollson didn't need to hurt someone every day. He needed them to believe he could. He thrived on fear that lingered long after he walked away. That fear was racialized. Black inmates felt his presence differently. They understood they were being targeted, not randomly, not emotionally, but deliberately. Pollson wanted submission, visibility, proof that he could still control others even inside a prison designed to control him. And for years it worked. Guards saw pieces of it. They heard rumors. They noticed tension. But tension wasn't evidence. Fear wasn't paperwork. As long as Pollson didn't cross the line too visibly, enforcement remained selective. A warning here, a privilege taken there, enough to appear in control, not enough to stop him. In that silence, Pollson grew confident. He believed his size made him untouchable, that his reputation protected him, that no one, especially not an older, quiet inmate, would dare challenge him. What Pollson didn't understand is that psychological terror only works until it meets someone immune to fear, someone who watched instead of reacted, someone who calculated instead of exploded, someone who understood that the most dangerous men aren't loud, they're patient. And by the time Pollson noticed that kind of patience in Bumpy Johnson, it was already too late.
The first test came quietly. No fists, no shouting, just a calculated humiliation delivered in plain sight. It was lunchtime inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the one place where violence was least expected and most dangerous. Guards lined the perimeter. Eyes scanned every table. Inmates ate quickly, spoke softly, and avoided attention. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat with other black inmates, eating in silence, just another body following routine. Then Eric Pollson walked past. Without stopping, without asking, without breaking stride, he reached down, took the dessert from Johnson's tray, and kept walking. A small thing, an apple pie portion, but inside prison walls, nothing is small. Food is dignity. Food is boundary. Food taken is dominance asserted. Pollson sat down across the room and ate the dessert slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on Johnson the entire time, waiting. Around Johnson, bodies tensed, men shifted in their seats. This was the moment everyone recognized, the moment where a reputation is either defended or destroyed. A response was expected, a reaction demanded, but it never came. Johnson looked at the empty space on his tray, looked at Pollson eating what had been his, and then he went back to his meal. No glare, no words, no movement, just silence. To some watching, it looked like weakness. An older man backing down from a larger, more violent predator. A legend from Harlem reduced to swallowing humiliation in front of an audience. Pollson certainly thought so. He smiled. He relaxed. He learned the wrong lesson. What Pollson didn't understand, what many inmates didn't understand yet, was that silence inside a prison can be louder than any threat. Johnson wasn't afraid. He was measuring. Every second Pollson spent feeling untouchable was a second Johnson was collecting information. Guard positions, reactions, patterns, escalation. Because in prison politics, the first man to react is usually the one who loses. And as Pollson finished that stolen dessert, confident he'd just established dominance, one question hung in the air, unspoken, unanswered, and deadly. Was this fear or was this strategy? The second test came where dignity is already stripped away. The showers. A long concrete room, steam rising, water echoing off tile and steel. No privacy, no comfort, no witnesses who could claim they saw too much. Inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the showers were a proving ground. Every man was vulnerable there, and everyone knew it. A shove in the wrong place could mean a broken skull. A slip could be written off as an accident. That's why Pollson chose it. Johnson was washing quietly when Pollson entered. Plenty of open shower heads, plenty of space, but Pollson walked straight toward him, closing the distance deliberately. Then came the shove. Hard enough to send Johnson sliding on the wet concrete. Hard enough to draw eyes. Not hard enough, Pollson knew, to look like an outright assault. Johnson caught himself against the wall before he fell, and Pollson made sure everyone heard him. A territorial claim, a public degradation. The message wasn't just for Johnson, it was for everyone watching. This was how prison power worked, not through constant violence, but through moments designed to test response. Pollson wanted Johnson to explode, wanted him to swing first, because in Alcatraz, the man who throws the first punch loses everything. Solitary, extended sentence, endless scrutiny. Johnson understood that better than anyone. So, instead of reacting, he did something far more dangerous. He stood up slowly, water running down his face. He looked at Pollson, not with anger, not with fear, but with calm assessment. And then he stepped away. No argument, no insult returned, no show of defiance. To outsiders, it looked like submission, but to seasoned inmates, it was a warning. Because in prison politics, reacting too early is fatal. Not physically, legally, administratively. Once you're labeled the aggressor, your options disappear. Your story doesn't matter. Your reasons don't matter. Johnson wasn't avoiding conflict. He was delaying it. He was letting Pollson cross lines, small ones first, building a pattern, creating witnesses, waiting for the moment when response would no longer look like revenge, but necessity. As Pollson finished that stolen dessert, confident he'd just established dominance, one question hung in the air, unspoken, unanswered, and deadly. Was this fear, or was this strategy?
The second test came where dignity is already stripped away. The showers. A long concrete room, steam rising, water echoing off tile and steel. No privacy, no comfort, no witnesses who could claim they saw too much. Inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the showers were a proving ground. Every man was vulnerable there, and everyone knew it. A shove in the wrong place could mean a broken skull. A slip could be written off as an accident. That's why Pollson chose it. Johnson was washing quietly when Pollson entered. Plenty of open shower heads, plenty of space, but Pollson walked straight toward him, closing the distance deliberately. Then came the shove, hard enough to send Johnson sliding on the wet concrete, hard enough to draw eyes, not hard enough, Pollson knew, to look like an outright assault. Johnson caught himself against the wall before he fell, and Pollson made sure everyone heard him. A territorial claim, a public degradation. The message wasn't just for Johnson, it was for everyone watching. This was how prison power worked, not through constant violence, but through moments designed to test response. Pollson wanted Johnson to explode, wanted him to swing first, because in Alcatraz, the man who throws the first punch loses everything. Solitary, extended sentence, endless scrutiny. Johnson understood that better than anyone. So instead of reacting, he did something far more dangerous. He stood up slowly, water running down his face. He looked at Pollson, not with anger, not with fear, but with calm assessment. And then he stepped away. No argument, no insult returned, no show of defiance. To outsiders, it looked like submission, but to seasoned inmates, it was a warning. because in prison politics, reacting too early is fatal, not physically, legally, administratively. Once you're labeled the aggressor, your options disappear. Your story doesn't matter. Your reasons don't matter. Johnson wasn't avoiding conflict. He was delaying it. He was letting Pollson cross lines, small ones first, building a pattern, creating witnesses, waiting for the moment when response would no longer look like revenge, but necessity. As Pollson walked away from the showers that day, satisfied he'd humiliated an older man without consequence, he believed he'd won. What he didn't realize was that with that shove, he'd just stepped deeper into a trap, one that only closed when the timing was perfect.
The third test unfolded in the open, the yard. This was where inmates walked, talked, and measured one another under the sky, where reputations were displayed instead of whispered. There were no walls to hide behind here, no steam, no shadows, just eyes, dozens of them. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson moved along the perimeter path with 2 other inmates, slow and deliberate as he always did. Routine, predictable, calm. That predictability is exactly what Eric Pollson counted on. Pollson stepped directly into Johnson's path. He didn't shove this time. He didn't touch him at all. He blocked him. A simple act, but inside a prison yard, blocking a man's movement is a public declaration. It says, "I control where you go." Pollson stood there, chest out, unblinking, daring Johnson to challenge him. This wasn't about a walkway. It was about hierarchy. Around them, the yard went quiet. Conversations faded. Heads turned. Everyone understood what was happening. This was dominance being tested in full view of inmates and guards alike. Johnson stopped. He looked at Pollson briefly. Then he stepped off the path and walked around him. No words, no confrontation, no resistance. Pollson laughed loudly, satisfied, his confidence swelling. He had just forced a respected inmate to move around him in front of the entire yard, and nothing had happened. To Pollson, the lesson was clear. He wasn't just untouchable, he was winning. But confidence is a dangerous thing in prison. The men who survive the longest are not the loudest or the strongest. They are the ones who know when to stop. Pollson didn't. He mistook restraint for fear, silence for surrender, patience for weakness, and that miscalculation was fatal. In prison culture, bullies don't fall because they're challenged too early. They fall because they push too far, because they get comfortable, because they start believing their own myth. Confidence is what gets bullies killed in prison. By the time Pollson walked away from that yard, laughing and unafraid, he had crossed another invisible line. Not the kind written in rule books, but the kind enforced by men who understand how power really works behind bars. And now, everyone was watching, because whatever came next would not be quiet. The breaking point didn't come when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was insulted. It didn't come when he was shoved. It didn't even come when he was publicly humiliated. It came when Eric Pollson chose the wrong target. A young inmate, barely in his 20s, small, quiet, non-violent, the kind of man Alcatraz swallowed whole. It was late afternoon inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary during recreation. The yard buzzed with low conversation, footsteps on concrete, pages turning. The young inmate sat alone on a bench reading, trying to disappear into a book. Pollson saw him immediately. Predators always do. Pollson approached slowly, casually, like a man with nothing to fear. He stopped in front of the bench, looked down, and took the book out of the young man's hands without asking. He mocked him,
belittled him, made sure others could hear. When the young inmate reached up politely to get his book back, Pollson struck him, hard enough to knock him off the bench and onto the concrete. The book followed, thrown into dirty water near a drain. The message was unmistakable. You are small. You are powerless. You exist at my mercy. For a moment, no one moved. That hesitation is part of prison life. Step in too fast and you become the next target. Step in too late and you live with the knowledge that you did nothing. Guards finally intervened, but just barely. A shout, a command to break it up, a warning issued with all the weight of routine. Pollson wasn't dragged away. He wasn't isolated. He wasn't punished in any meaningful way. The young inmate was sent to the infirmary, bloodied, shaken, humiliated, and the system moved on. That night, something shifted. Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't pace or rage. He sat quietly among other inmates, his expression calm, his posture unchanged. But those who knew him, really knew him, understood. Patience had a limit. Johnson had endured insults aimed at himself. That was a calculation. But an unprovoked attack on someone who couldn't defend himself, that crossed a line prisons don't write down, but men enforce. In that moment, Johnson understood something clearly. If he stayed silent now, Pollson would escalate. If he waited longer, someone weaker would be hurt worse. And if he acted too late, the damage would be irreversible. Patience had done its job. It had revealed the pattern. It had exposed the threat. It had created witnesses. And now, restraint was no longer protection. It was permission. That night, Johnson made a decision, not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of necessity. The waiting was over. What came next would not be impulsive. It would not be emotional. It would be final.
That night, Alcatraz settled into its usual darkness. Cell lights dimmed one by one. Steel doors slammed shut, their echoes rolling through concrete corridors like distant thunder. The rock grew quiet, but not calm. Inside that silence, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, not to draw attention. He spoke the way men speak when decisions are already made. There was no anger in his voice, no urgency, no performance, just certainty. Johnson didn't threaten Eric Pollson by name. He didn't promise violence. He didn't need to. Everyone around him already understood what he was saying and what he wasn't. This wasn't bravado. It wasn't revenge. It was a statement of inevitability. Johnson had waited. He had observed. He had endured. And now the calculation was complete. In prison, the most dangerous warnings are never shouted. They're delivered quietly, without emotion, because emotion signals doubt. Johnson had none. He didn't say if, he said when. Tomorrow. Not someday, not eventually, not when the moment feels right. Tomorrow. Men listening felt it immediately, the shift in gravity. Conversations ended. Eyes dropped. No one questioned him. No one challenged him. Because they knew this wasn't a man testing an idea out loud. This was a man informing the room of a conclusion. Johnson understood timing better than most men ever would. He knew that violence, to be effective, had to be unavoidable and unquestionable. It had to happen where witnesses could see it, where intent couldn't be twisted, where the message would be permanent. And he also understood something Pollson never did. Once patience ends, there is no going back. As the cell block darkened,
and the final doors slammed into place, Alcatraz slept, unaware that by the next afternoon, its cafeteria would become the setting for one of the most legendary moments in prison history. No shouting had announced it, no threats had warned of it, only a quiet certainty that tomorrow one man would learn a lesson he could never forget. Friday came like every other day. The cafeteria at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary filled on schedule. 200 men moved in lines, trays in hand, eyes forward. Guards took their positions along the walls. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt tense, at least not on the surface. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat down and began to eat. Then Eric Pollson arrived. Instead of going to his assigned seat, Pollson walked directly to Johnson's table and sat across from him. It was a violation of routine, subtle but deliberate. Heads turned. A few inmates stopped eating. Pollson spoke. Johnson did not respond. That silence lasted only a moment, but it mattered. When Pollson leaned forward again, louder this time, the room tightened. Guards noticed the posture change, but didn't move yet. Words alone were not enough. Then Pollson turned his attention away from Johnson toward a younger inmate seated several tables away, a threat delivered openly now, public, unmistakable. That was when Johnson stood. No sudden movement, no rush, just a controlled rise from the bench. What followed took less than 4 seconds. Johnson closed the distance between them without running. Pollson began to stand, but he was already late. Johnson's motion was compact, efficient, practiced. There was no wasted effort, no hesitation. 2 movements, clean, immediate. Pollson collapsed backward, the sound of his body hitting the floor, cutting through the cafeteria like a gunshot. For a fraction of a second, there was no noise at all. No shouting, no screaming, just shock. Then everything happened at once. Guard whistles pierced the air, boots pounded concrete, orders were shouted, inmates dropped to the floor or backed away from the tables. Johnson did not resist. He stepped back, released what he was holding, and raised his hands before the guards reached him. He went down under their weight without a word. Pollson remained on the floor, alive, but permanently changed. The entire incident, from the moment Johnson stood to the moment guards restrained him, was over before most men in the room fully understood what they had just witnessed. There was no chaos in the act itself, no frenzy, no loss of control, only precision, only inevitability. And then, silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the cafeteria as Pollson was carried away and Johnson was led out in cuffs. In Alcatraz, violence was common, but this was different, because everyone there understood the same thing at the same time. This hadn't been an outburst. It hadn't been emotional. It was the end of something. And nothing inside the rock would ever be quite the same again.
The aftermath began immediately. Eric Pollson was carried out of the cafeteria under guard escort, blood soaking through prison fabric, his screams echoing down corridors that had heard many before, but rarely like this. He was rushed off the island for emergency medical treatment, his injuries severe enough to bypass Alcatraz's limited infirmary. One eye would never recover. For the first time since his arrival on the rock, Eric Pollson was powerless. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson never saw the medical response. Within moments of the incident, he was taken in the opposite direction, down narrow corridors, past steel doors, and into solitary confinement. The hole. A place where time lost meaning, where light was rationed, where silence pressed in from every side. Johnson was searched
stripped of his possessions and locked away alone while the institution moved into damage control mode, because this incident couldn't be ignored. An investigation followed, formal, methodical, exhaustive. Guards were interviewed, inmates were questioned, incident reports were written and rewritten, and slowly a pattern emerged, not just of one confrontation, but of many. Pollson's behavior surfaced again and again in testimony: the stolen food, the shove in the showers, the blocking in the yard, the verbal harassment, the attack on a smaller, non-violent inmate just one day before the cafeteria incident. Witnesses told the same story from different angles, different tables, different cell blocks. This wasn't spontaneous violence, it was escalation. And Johnson's own statement was brief and consistent. He didn't deny what he had done. He didn't dramatize it. He framed it exactly as he had planned to: self-defense and defense of another inmate after repeated provocation. The administration faced a dilemma. To punish Johnson severely would mean admitting that a known predator had been allowed to terrorize other inmates unchecked, that harassment had been visible, that warnings had been ignored, that the institution designed for absolute control had failed at its most basic responsibility. So the response was calculated. Johnson was found guilty of possessing a weapon and using it. Rules had been broken. That much could not be denied. But the punishment was limited: 30 days in solitary confinement, no additional years added to his sentence, no public acknowledgement of the deeper failure. Quietly, without announcement, Eric Pollson was transferred out of Alcatraz once he recovered, removed from the environment where he had once believed himself untouchable. Officially, order had been restored. Unofficially, a message had been received. The institution moved on, reports were filed away, guards returned to routine. But inside the rock, everyone understood what had really happened. The system hadn't stopped the violence, it had merely reacted to the man who ended it. And in that quiet, unspoken admission, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson emerged from solitary confinement not as a punished inmate, but as a confirmed force, a man the prison had tested and failed to break. Stories travel fast in prison, faster than official reports, faster than transfers, faster than time itself. When inmates left Alcatraz, sent to other federal facilities, released back into the system, or reassigned for medical or administrative reasons, they carried the story with them. They didn't carry paperwork, they carried memory. What happened in that cafeteria became more than an incident. It became a warning. From Leavenworth to Atlanta, from Marion to Lewisburg, the story spread the way prison legends always do, quietly, between cells, in whispered conversations during work details, in fragments passed along by men who had nothing else to trade but information. An older man, a larger predator, 3 seconds that changed everything. Details varied with retellings, but the core never changed: the patience, the precision, the finality. Inside prison culture, that matters, because prisons are built on hierarchy, and hierarchy is built on perception. Once a story proves that size can be neutralized, that strength can be bypassed, that reputation can be destroyed in moments, that story doesn't fade. It embeds itself. For black inmates especially, the legend carried weight. It wasn't just about violence, it was about dignity defended when the system failed to do so. It was about intelligence prevailing where brute force had ruled unchecked. But the story endured because it wasn't reckless. Johnson didn't lash out, he didn't explode, he didn't act on rage. He waited. He allowed witnesses. He let the threat reveal itself. He chose a moment where action would be undeniable.
That distinction mattered. In prison, impulsive violence shortened sentences and lives. Strategic violence reshapes environments. Johnson's act didn't just end one man's intimidation, it recalibrated behavior across an entire institution. Men thought twice after that. Words were swallowed, lines were respected, silence returned, but this time it carried caution. The lesson was clear, and it traveled well. Intelligence over size, timing over rage, strategy over impulse. Those ideas outlasted Alcatraz itself. Decades later, long after the prison closed, the story was still told, not because it was brutal, but because it was precise, because it showed how power really works in places designed to strip it away. Legends endure when they teach something essential, and this one taught that the most dangerous man in any prison is not the loudest, not the strongest, but the one who knows exactly when to act and never acts twice.
Alcatraz was designed to teach men how to endure, how to wake up on concrete, how to eat in silence, how to survive routine, isolation, and fear without breaking. It taught men how to keep their heads down, how to wait, how to live inside rules that rarely protected them. But Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson taught something different. He taught that survival alone was not enough. Inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, strength was measured every day, but rarely understood. Many believed size was power, that violence was dominance, that fear was control. Johnson proved otherwise. He showed that patience could be sharper than rage, that intelligence could outmaneuver brute force, that timing, perfectly chosen, could end what endless endurance never would. He waited when others demanded reaction. He watched when others rushed, and when the moment came, he acted once, decisively, and never needed to act again. As the sun set over San Francisco Bay, wind cutting across dark water, Alcatraz stood unmoved. The prison remained, the routines continued, the walls kept their secrets. But something had changed inside them. Because long after the echoes faded from that cafeteria, long after the doors closed and the reports were filed, men remembered the lesson. Alcatraz taught men how to survive. Bumpy Johnson taught them when to strike.